Okay. Okay. Good evening and welcome to the first program of Winchester Academy's Fall 2021 series. My name is Pat Fair and I'm a trustee of Winchester Academy. First of all, I'd like to thank the City of Waupaca and our producer Josh Warner for providing the technology to bring tonight's program to you in multiple formats. I'd also like to thank the Granite Cellar Bar at the Danes Hall for hosting a viewing party tonight. And for those of you who are over there, we hope you're enjoying yourself. Our next Winchester program will be in 1 week, October the 18th. We'll be hosting Dr. David Gamm. His talk will cover his exciting cutting-edge research using stem cells at UW-Madison. Ought to be an interesting program. This program will also be hybrid with live streaming and in-person attendance. Options will be available. I'd also like to thank Badger Talks, which is a statewide service which helps to refer speakers like we have this evening. We'd like to thank them for their participation. And tonight's program is sponsored by Diane Forsyth in honor of her parents, Jane and Ernie Lindgren. Ernie was a trustee of Winchester Academy several years ago. We will be having a Q&A session following the presentation tonight. Questions may be submitted from our audience or via Facebook Live or by telephone. The phone number is 715-942-9917. Once again, the phone number is 715-942-9917. 9917. So that takes us to our speakers. Our speakers tonight are Mr. Joel Salmons and his graduate student, Ms. Sarah Holstrom, who is a student in linguistics, graduate student in linguistics. Joe is in language sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He works on language broadly, especially speech sounds and language change, often drawing data from the Germanic languages. This includes his teaching, research, and collaboration with the public, and he tries to integrate those things into a coherent whole. He's also part of the Wisconsin Language Project and works with the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. So without further ado, please welcome Joe and Sarah.
Thank you. I can't tell you how exciting it is to be talking about this stuff in front of live human beings after way too close to 2 years of doing it. The stuff that we're going to talk about tonight is work that has come from a variety of faculty, a variety of graduate students, and a variety of undergraduate students at UW-Madison. And it has also come in many ways, in many cases, from events like this. We have published a lot of papers from things that people have asked at one of these talks. What about X? Well, we don't know about X, but we can find out about X. So this is really important for us in all sorts of ways, and we're really, really happy to be here. What we're going to do is pretty simple. I'm going to ask you some questions along the way and compare your answers to some other answers to those questions that we've got about English in Wisconsin. And it's just going to be three basic things. A little bit about the awareness and history of English in Wisconsin, a little bit about attitudes toward English in Wisconsin, which are very different from the attitudes toward English in the South, where I come from, and you'll hear that eventually if you haven't heard it in my voice yet. And then finally, some features of Wisconsin English, where Sarah's going to talk about some really exciting work that she's doing. And we'll have Q&A, and that's what makes it worthwhile for us. We will travel a couple of hours any day to have some public question and answer stuff. So my first question, and for the people in the room, what screams Wisconsin English to you? What do you hear and say, they're from Wisconsin?
Bubblers.
Yes. Two bubblers.
Saying fur instead of four.
Saying fur instead of four.
Round O's.
Round O's like
O.
oh,
Yeah.
don't know.
Old.
Ending a question with or no.
Beautiful. So Sarah, you will confirm I have not set this up with anybody. Okay, anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Best audience ever. I quit. We're going home. We're going home right now. It's over. Every time we do this, whatever part of the state, we always get usually not two instantaneous, simultaneous answers of bubbler, but we regularly get that. This is a sign from from Adventure Park in Milwaukee, a photo from a colleague, a linguist, Sonia Barnes at Marquette. Bubbler closed, water fountain for all ya out-of-towners. So this is an iconic Wisconsin thing. So how many of you actually say bubbler? There aren't many anymore. Do you think a water fountain and a drinking fountain and a bubbler are different things?
Yes, they are. Yes. Yes.
You have the same system that my wife has. If the water goes over like that, it's a drinking fountain, and if the water comes up straight out of the middle?
No.
No?
The bubblers bubbled out of a little ceramic globe with a hole in the middle, and it just bubbled out and flowed down, and you had to get your mouth right down into the water to drink from a bubbler.
Were you going to say the same thing?
And there were two of them in front of the old building that used to be here.
Same design,
Sorry.
only it was metal, and on Washington Avenue in Racine, Wisconsin, there were two of them just along the street for when you needed it.
Beautiful. So here's the history. It's a fairly straightforward history. It's unsurprising, and your story is the story that we have. So Kohler designed two different kinds of valves. One where the water shoots across, and the other one, like you've described, where the water comes straight up. And the second one was called the bubbling valve. And wherever that was sold, the name bubbler tended to stick. So Rhode Island, some parts of New England say bubbler, believe it or not. And my wife, who's from Madison, and I were almost 20 years ago in Melbourne, Australia, at a big linguistics conference, and she came running up to me during the coffee break and said, "You're not going to believe what just happened. Somebody asked me where the bubbler is." And I said, "Oh, come on, there's so many Wisconsinites who become linguists." She said, "No, total Australian accent." It turns out they sold the bubbler valve in Melbourne, so it's a term in Melbourne, Australia, or at least it was 20 years ago. So yeah, that's an easy one. We get that immediately. We did a survey a couple of years ago. Miranda Wilkerson, former grad student who's a professor now in Missouri, did a survey, and you see on the map, we had a huge number of respondents, and the blue dots are people who say, "Yep, I say bubbler." You see that it's not by any means all of Wisconsin. So you go to Stevens Point or you go to Eau Claire or someplace and you ask people, what's iconic Wisconsin English? What screams Wisconsin English? And you'll regularly get the answer bubbler. And you ask in a room of 50 or 100 people, which I hope we'll soon be able to have again, and you maybe get 5 hands going up. People think of it as iconic even if they don't use it themselves. Now look at people who say they have friends who say bubbler. That's pretty much everybody. The skew of the distribution is where we got our respondents from. It was an online survey. So maybe you don't say bubbler yourself. Maybe you're from Wisconsin. Maybe you're just absolutely Wisconsin to the bone. But it doesn't mean you don't have that impression of Wisconsin English. And maybe you're not even from Wisconsin. Maybe you're from Melbourne, Australia, and you've never heard of Wapaka. It's hard to believe, but maybe it's true. And you still say bubbler. So even the stuff that is most typically associated with the state and how we speak English here is not as simple as you might think it is. There's a more complex relationship. Next question. You don't have to answer out loud, but you can if you want to. I can usually tell from how somebody talks whether they're from Wisconsin. You strongly agree, agree, somewhat agree, neither do you agree or disagree to varying degrees. Somewhat? I'm seeing some nodding, I'm hearing some somewhats. So there's a whole interesting field of study, and Sarah's going to be contributing to this pretty soon in some of her work, I strongly suspect, of thinking about and trying to understand what reaction people have to other people's speech. We've been here for 2 hours and we've heard a whole bunch of stories about, when I, with my Wisconsin accent, went to this other place, or when these people from this other place came here. I'm going to play you 3 recordings, or Sarah's going to play you 3 recordings, and you just need to say, is this person from Wisconsin, yes or no?
The story of Arthur and the rat. Once there was a young rat who couldn't make up his mind.
Play it again.
The story of Arthur and the rat. Once there was a young rat who couldn't make up his mind.
Yes. Not a single hand goes up. No. Almost every hand in the room goes up. Okay, hold that thought. Would you be kind enough to play speaker number 2?
Once there was a young rat named Arthur who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he would like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know."
Play it one more time.
Once there was a young rat named Arthur who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he would like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know."
Yes. Bunch of yeses, a couple of possibilities. No. Only 2 no's. Maybe a couple of people answered and weren't completely certain. Okay, so number 1, definitely no. Number 2, pretty much yes, but some uncertainty. Play number 3 if you would be so kind.
Once there was a young rat named Arthur who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he'd like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know."
We don't even need that one a second time. From Wisconsin, yes or no?
No.
No. That's me speaking. So the way I'm speaking now is as standard as I can speak. That's me shifted a little bit toward North Carolina, and you wouldn't have understood me if I was speaking full on North Carolina. So number 3, that was too easy. Speaker number 1 was actually, oops, I'm sorry, I flipped the dates. Speaker number 1 is actually a woman from Plymouth, Wisconsin, up by Sheboygan, in Sheboygan County, recorded in the 1950s. And we have a bunch of recordings made in the 1950s and 60s and across the state, and typically people cannot identify them, just like you. They say, nope, she's not from Wisconsin. Speaker number 2 is the one who's from 2010. Same place, same city, same part of Wisconsin, 20 years, 30 years younger, and recorded 60 years later. And now you can, maybe not with certainty, but you can pretty much identify as a group that she's a Wisconsin speaker. And number 3, that was me, recorded for a study that we did. That's a really weird fact. You can't, and this is robust, we've done it across a bunch of recordings with different people, different listeners, and a lot of listeners. People from the 1950s and 60s, you cannot identify them as sounding Wisconsin. People recorded in the 2010s and more recently, you can. That's pretty interesting. We were surprised when we found that. And so we did a whole study of this, and this is just to the question. We ask a bunch of questions. We played recordings like this, and we ask, is this person from Wisconsin, yes or no? And the two North Carolinians are on this end. Almost nobody thought they were Wisconsinites. Next were two people from Boston, and none of these people had, you heard my segment. That's not a stereotypical Southern accent. You can hear some Southern, but it's not over the top. And the Boston, they don't sound particularly Boston to me, and I know people from Boston. They were pretty accurate. Then look at the far end. We had recordings from Plymouth, Eau Claire, and Milwaukee. The old recordings from Milwaukee were the lowest accuracy rate. The woman that you just heard is the lowest. Almost nobody got her right. So it was basically like this room. We had a new and an old Californian. People can't identify a California accent off of these little snippets. So there was sort of random. There's kind of chance, pretty much. And who's in the middle? 70, 75% accuracy. The new speakers from Eau Claire, Plymouth, and Milwaukee. And this was, statistically, it was just completely clear. Old speakers recorded in the 50s, and you can do the same thing with speakers recorded in the 60s. People cannot reliably identify a Wisconsin accent. Maybe there's some exceptions, but most of the time that's it. Young speakers from Wisconsin, even with no stereotype, right? That young woman didn't say, hey, dim over there, yeah, or anything like that. It was completely normal sounding speech. And you ask people who do that survey, say, well, how did you know she was from Wisconsin? So, I don't know. It just sounded normal to me. People have a sense of it, even though it's not really super conscious. So very high accuracy, non-Wisconsin speakers, very low accuracy, California and old Wisconsin speakers, and the new Wisconsin speakers are shifting toward the way Boston and North Carolina work. People can now start recognizing a Wisconsin accent. What this means is that Wisconsin English is a new thing. 50, 60 years ago, there was not a distinct way of speaking in Wisconsin. I can talk a whole bunch more about this in the Q&A if you want. But in some areas, the South, the Northeast, and a few other places, people know, oh yeah, that's what Louisiana English sounds like. Oh yeah, that's what New Hampshire English sounds like. That's a very recent thing here. It's older in many parts of the country, but it's new here. It's still emerging. It's still coming. It's going to be stronger in the next generation. We can record people at different ages in Wisconsin and measure that they sound more Wisconsin the younger they get. Okay, so what did you think about, you think you can tell somebody from Wisconsin? The earlier question. No, yeah, maybe. Somewhat, yeah, so sort of in the middle. Here's what our responses were on this survey. A few people strongly agreed, a bunch of people agreed, most people were somewhat agreeing, and relatively few people disagreed. So people tended to think now that they can recognize a Wisconsin accent, and these were Wisconsin respondents. Now let's get into something that's really directly about attitudes. Do you think Wisconsin English sounds friendly? When you hear somebody, you go somewhere and like people are talking with, you know, a local accent in Wisconsin, sound friendly to you?
Yes.
I'm seeing heads nodding. I'm seeing one kind of maybe, sort of, yeah, okay. This is something where there's been a lot of study too, not done by us, but by other people, and I'll tell you in just a second. You think Wisconsin English is generally good, correct English? Oh, I'm hearing a lot of and seeing a lot of maybes and a couple of no's. So pretty mixed picture on that one. So friendly, but maybe not so correct is what I'm getting here. UW-Madison PhD from many, many years ago, Dennis Preston, did this classic survey. He took a whole bunch of people in Michigan and a whole bunch of people in Alabama. And he said, He didn't play anything. He didn't give them any linguistic information. He just said, okay, where in the United States do people speak the most correct English? Guess what the Michiganders said?
Michigan.
Look at the map. Darker and bigger means more correct. Upper Midwest. Michiganders know they speak the best English. Maybe we're okay. Maybe Minnesota's okay. Maybe Ohio's okay. But it's Michigan. What do you think about least correct? Well, look at the lightest and smallest states. My home state's not that bad, but boy, you get down to Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, not correct English. What do you think that Alabamians said to the same question? The people in Alabama said, well, of course we speak correct English. Those people in Michigan, that's horrible English. No, they don't. Look at the correctness view. Alabamians thought that the South, maybe not exactly their part of the South, but the South didn't speak correct English. Who speaks really correct English? Further north, it's more scattered than the Michigan picture was, but everybody sort of agrees. Upper Midwest is more correct, South is less correct. And I can tell you as a Southerner, we're raised with that. Oh no, we don't speak proper English. No way. But flip it around to pleasantness. Who sounds friendly? I'm just going to show you one of the maps here, but the picture is pretty straightforward. Ask a bunch of Alabamians, who's pleasant sounding? It's the South. End of story. Who's unpleasant sounding? New York, New Jersey, Upper Midwest, part of the Lower Midwest. And it's a complete flip. It's not as dramatic with Michigan, but Michiganders sort of, South, they sound pretty pleasant. Not correct, but it sounds pleasant. So the attitudes are pretty strikingly different. In terms of Wisconsin English sounds friendly to me, you see that people overwhelm. It's basically you're tracking exactly like our survey track. People say, oh yeah, definitely strongly agree or agree. Almost nobody disagreed or strongly disagreed. Big sample and a really clear outcome from across the state. Wisconsin English is generally good, correct English. You were, as a group, centered right in the middle of that from what I could hear and see. And that's exactly where our respondents were. Somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, and neither agree nor disagree. It's really different impressions of what is pleasant sounding and what is correct sounding, and it really maps pretty well. We can go back and talk about how that compares to Michigan and what the Michiganders think, but it's a really interesting finding for us to see this. Now, let's talk for just a minute about correctness in language, what good English is. There's a whole industry in the press talking about good English and bad English, and why bad English has to be stamped out, and the people who speak bad English should be punished. Here's just the latest one. This is from the Boston Globe from this summer. Losing battles with the language, I'm having trouble accepting the corruptions of English, which seem to get more numerous and hideous with every sunrise. And the article is just a long list of complaints. What are her complaints? She has one classic. She hates the word irregardless. It should be regardless in her view. She's very upset about people saying simpatico, meaning nice. She says, no, that's an Italian word. Saying simpatico to mean sympathetic. It's an Italian word and it means nice, and it's all it means, and you can't change anything about it. And she has a whole set of these. One of them that you may have noticed people saying is, if you have any questions, talk to Mary or myself instead of Mary or me. She's very upset about these things. These things are destroying the language. The corruptions of English, which seem to get more numerous and hideous with every sunrise. Who's doing this? Who's destroying the English language this way? Oh, well, you are maybe, but who's really doing it?
Writers.
It's the children. It's the young people. And often, yes?
Yes. I think that in our schools, in elementary schools, we have been teaching children that they can't use the pronoun me. I mean, I. Right. You can say me, but not I. And so they say, me and him are going to the movies. You can't say I.
This is what's called hypercorrection. People think, oh, I say me when I'm supposed to say I. And so then they say, oh, well, I shouldn't be saying I most of the time, like you just said. So then instead of saying between you and me, people say between you and I. That's called a hypercorrection, where people try to correct their speech and they overshoot. Excellent point. So correct grammar has a long history, and it's a very weird history. And just give you an example of it. A lot of our rules come from a guy named Robert Lowell, who was a professor of poetry at Oxford University in the early modern period. You can sort of tell where he's from by his clothes. He set out to create the language police. And he did it. And he did it based on logic and Latin, because Latin's a good language and logic is a good thing. So you're right, I can't disagree with that. So he comes up with some rules. So he says, okay, when somebody calls you on the phone and asks for you by name, do you say it's me or do you say it's I? Most of us say it's me. He said no. Why? Because in Latin, or in German, or in Russian, that would be nominative. It would be the I pronoun. Not how English works. And the way English works is this breakdown of I, me, distinctions, and so forth, going back centuries. He was doing this in the 18th century. So that's that. I don't know how many of you, I learned this in school, between is for two and among is for more than two. That's an invented rule. That's not how English worked traditionally. He made that up. And he somehow got it into grammar books. So that's a completely made up rule. Yeah, we do it today. I still do it myself a lot of the time. I call myself doing it yesterday. You're not supposed to split infinitives. You're not supposed to say to boldly go. Really, everybody pretty much, whether you admit it or not, does this in speech, and huge numbers of people do it in writing. I edited a scholarly journal for 20 years, and I could tell by looking at that whether the person was a native speaker or not. Non-native speakers never split infinitives. Native speakers split infinitives all the time. Why did he do that? If you know any Latin, the infinitive in Latin is a single word form. There is no two. You can't split a Latin infinitive. It's a word. It's you'd be putting a syllable into the middle of it. English doesn't work that way. He's insisting that English should work like Latin, which, I mean, he knew Latin pretty well, it looks like. Also, do you ever use double negatives? Well, some people don't. Most people do. Obviously a bad thing. No. All the Germanic languages used to have double negatives and used to use them very robustly. I use triple negatives, quadruple negatives. You can tell, if you know me well, how upset I am about something by whether I use a single negative, a double negative, or a triple negative. If you hear me use 4 negatives in one clause, something is very, very wrong with the world. It serves a purpose, and it's the same. I had a graduate student from Poland years ago, and she came to my office one day to meet about her dissertation, and she said, Joe, I heard that people from the South use double negatives. And I said, yes, I do it all the time. And she said, it's just like Polish. And I said, yes, it is. Can you use 4 negatives at once? And she said, only if it's a really, really emphatic context. Boom, you're just like us. End of story. And she was so happy to hear that she started using double negatives in English all the time. I told her not to do it in her dissertation. So in other words, this is an invention. This is an invention to enforce norms that had not existed. People talked perfectly normally and got along just fine before Lau invented these rules. And we still get along fine, and we violate those rules or don't violate those rules. So he wanted us to be speaking like we were speaking Latin. and to use logic. Two negatives make a positive. To which, you know the old joke, right? The English professor gets up and says, two negatives make a positive, but two positives never make a negative. And a student at the back says, yeah, right. That you can break that rule in either direction pretty much. So here's what this means in terms of Wisconsin, in terms of understanding the history of English. Yeah, Wisconsin English is seen as friendly, and that's a stereotype of the state, and it's borne out as well. And it's seen as reasonably correct, but that's pretty shaky ultimately. But the real thing is that correctness is a complicated and problematic notion. I mean, I still, after being a linguist for 45 years or whatever it is, I still, if I use a Southernism and somebody corrects me, I still have to like remind myself, oh no, that's fine. It's just like we need to talk about what correct grammar is and what dialectal speech is and so forth. So that's a piece of it. So I think this is my last example, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah. So we're back to your questions, and I swear I never gave away anything to anybody about what we were going to talk about tonight. Which of these would you say possibly when talking to friends? You can't say nice weather today. It was not nice weather today. But assuming a nice weather day, like we've had plenty of, nice weather today, yeah. Nice weather today, nice weather today, isn't it? What? Nice weather today, or no? Nice weather today, ain't it? Number one, you might say that? Yeah, so okay, so some kind of maybes and yeses. Nice weather today, eh? Yep. So enthusiastic, yep. Nice weather today, isn't it? Sure. Everybody pretty much. Nice weather today, or no? I got a few. Nice weather today, ain't it? Milwaukee. So the Dictionary of American Regional English, which was talked about here a few years ago, included in its questionnaire, how would you finish a sentence? We ought to come back here again, fill in the blank. So you could fill in the blank with any of those things that I just gave you, right? They got really interesting responses. A whole bunch of don't you think so? A few people didn't respond, and other things going down. What you don't see is any of they had two different questions. That's why there's answers in there that don't look like what you would expect with the she in them. The only one that's on our list is A. And A was reported by 9 people out of, I think, 1,200 people from across the United States. So we use a lot more of these in Wisconsin than they found in the dictionary. They got 3 ANAs from the upper Midwest. They got 0 or no's, but today you ask people, Fox Valley, other parts of the state, and that's a really big one. I was talking to a graduate student years ago about this question who was from Sauk County, rural Sauk County, west of the Dells, and I told her, that's really weird, like people won't admit to saying or no, but it's all over the place. And she started laughing, and I said, why are you laughing, Sam? And she said, oh, I'm laughing because I used to say that all the time until I came to Madison, and all of the non-Wisconsinites would say, what in the world is that? What are you doing? And I just stopped because it was so weird and so odd to do it. So that was just not really a thing there. And 2 hays show up in this. So we're doing a lot of this, and we're doing more of this than they actually were getting in the Dictionary of American Regional English. So it's there. Oh, and that one, ain't a hay. Nice weather today, ain't a hay. Which just, that takes a cake. If I ever hear somebody say ain't a hay, I'm going to record them saying it just for posterity. That is something that's happening here. It's happening a lot here. And we did our survey on this. Would you say ANA? And very few people, a third of the people said they recognize it as something people say. 3% admitted to saying it themselves. So that's more negative than bubbler. People are not admitting to saying it. People associated with Wisconsin English, definitely not proper English, more rural and more with older people, but neither one of those is terribly strong. But we got different responses for different ones. It's been cold lately, or no. We get most people recognize that as something people say. Almost a quarter of people say it themselves and admit to saying it themselves. So this one, they're both basically the same in meaning, very similar in meaning at least. And this one is faring much better. It's still thriving. And a lot of young people report saying this who don't report some of these other ones. So it's there. So that's the end of that. So there are all kinds of things that people associate very powerfully and consciously with Wisconsin. Bubbler, whether they say it or not, or no, and all of these other things. There is stuff like come here once, dim over there, the way that people pronounce bag. People are very conscious of those things. Where we're making a lot of progress right now is thinking about and looking at things that people are not conscious of, but where there's real change happening. And Sarah is just finishing a really amazing project about that. Yes?
We've got a question from online, and I think it's kind of important to address. Are we talking mostly about white people, or do these surveys go across the population?
That's an extremely important question. What we found, we don't have enough data to really say decisively. A lot of these trends are especially clear among white people, but a lot of these trends are also found among people of color, and it varies by trend. So bubbler use, it appears to be in the parts of the state, the eastern parts of the state, where that's the common word. It appears that most people use bubbler. And some of the other things differ. There's a very complicated set of vowel changes happening in Wisconsin. It's called the Northern Cities Shift that involves the pronunciation of and a whole bunch of other vowels. And what we found with that is that it's a very regional, distinctly regional pattern, and that's something that tends to be more among white speakers and less among people of color, although it really varies by community. And my colleague Tom Purnell has shown that among African Americans, people use that or don't use that in part as a correlation of how much contact they have with white people. So this is variable. It is similar patterns, but they are not identical patterns by any means. So I hope that answers the question. Now you're going to hear about Sarah's work.
Okay. All right. Sorry, just let me get settled here real quick. Okay. So, like Joe was saying, all of these features that he's talked about in Wisconsin English tend to be features that are noticeable, that everybody tends to be aware that bubbler is associated with a Wisconsin speech. Even ANA is associated with a Wisconsin speech. But there's also a lot of changes taking place that are kind of below the level of consciousness, that our speech is changing, but we're not really aware of it yet. So what I'm looking into is a change that almost nobody is noticing that's taking place in Wisconsin speech right now. So I want to have you guys try to say these words out loud, and I'm not going to prompt you. So let's say the first one. Okay, and then how about the second one? All right, so when you said those words, did you actually pronounce the T sound in either or both? I think a good amount of you, I heard that T sound pretty clearly, but that's, you're enunciating, right? And I heard some people say that they didn't, right? So let's say them again and try to pay attention to where your tongue is when you're saying the ends of those words. So right. So traditionally, the way that you pronounce the letter T at the end of a word, you've got your tongue and it's touching sort of behind your teeth. We call that the alveolar ridge, to sound, right? But what's actually happening a lot in younger speakers from Wisconsin is that they are, instead of pronouncing the word with that robust T sound, they're actually using what we call a glottal stop, which is where instead of pronouncing it with your tongue, you're just closing your throat almost like with your, where your vocal cords would be. So you're saying foot or can't. And So this is just a picture of the speech waves, the sound waves, what it looks like when a person actually says the word foot. So we can give an example of what that actually sounds like. I think Joe has the plays. So somebody saying it with a glottal form.
But.
So I don't know if you heard that. It's just foot. And we can actually even see that when we, in my research, I look at the actual sound, or look at the sound waves, and you can see these at the bottom of the screen there, we call it the spectrogram, and you can see little vertical lines, and that's what tells us that speakers are actually saying that with that glottal form rather than saying the t sound. And in the same way, there's another version. Some speakers are actually not even saying the glottal stop. They're just not even using a stop at the end of the word. They're just saying, rather than rat coarsely, they're saying rat coarsely, and kind of just doing something in their throat rather than actually producing that sound. We can have one more example of the sounds, right? So you can hear the speaker doing that. Oh. Yeah. Got ahead of ourselves there.
Sorry, I'm not.
You know what? It's okay. We don't need to hear it. It's just so you're just aware that the speakers are younger speakers today are starting to use either these forms of T where they're saying producing the T in their throat rather than from their tongue. And so the results also show essentially the same thing. What I said, we looked at those recordings. If you remember, Joe at the beginning of the talk talked about those recordings of speakers from the 1950s. And this research basically aligns with what he said, which is that the speakers from the 1950s didn't really have any distinct accent features at that time. So they're all producing their T's very clearly. They're enunciating what we would say. It's clearly a T form for the most part. And as you get to speakers from today, so speakers who were born around my generation in the 1990s, are actually producing these glottal forms much more often than the speakers from the 1950s. And so that ties into what we've been saying all along, which is that this speakers can recognize now, listeners can recognize that speakers of this current generation are from Wisconsin. There's something going on. A lot of listeners say, I don't know why I know that the speaker's from Wisconsin, but I can tell that something about it sounds like they're from Wisconsin. And so this is one of those underlying features that you may not be aware of what you're hearing, what exactly the difference is between somebody speaking with the glottal stop versus the T, but that feature is starting to indicate that somebody may be from Wisconsin, that they're doing this. Yes, I see a question over there.
I know that personally, I grew up saying button
Yes.
instead of button. My mom would always correct me, and I'd be like, I can't do it.
That is a really common thing. Oh, yeah, so this, we had a question here over that they said button growing up rather than button, and that their mom corrected them to say button instead. It's very common. There has been research into this across the US that especially it's associated with actually Utah and on the Mountain West region, where the speakers will say button, and that is stigmatized, or they say mountain rather than mountain. And that's something that is somewhat stigmatized. But in Wisconsin, it's not something that typically is stigmatized, but it is something that speakers are doing, but they're just not aware of it. Yes?
I think there's a generational thing. I grew up in the 1930s, right? And I had a dad who, I mean, the family ate around the dinner table. That was also generational. But if you spoke not clearly or didn't enunciate, in fact, the word enunciate, I wonder how many elementary school kids today even know the word enunciate. And in our school systems, I don't think we emphasize pronunciation anymore and diction.
It's definitely different, and you can actually see that, I think, in the recordings. There's just a different priorities, I guess you would say, in the sense that when you listen to the recordings from the 1950s, many of these speakers, you can tell, not all of them though, some of them also just didn't have any education whatsoever. But the speakers from, many of them also you can tell that they were trained to read in a certain way, in a very much more formal way, and they're speaking more formally than when you listen to the recordings from today, and they were not really trained to speak formally. And so that's just a difference that you get in terms of people who were born in, let's say, 1900 versus 1990. So that's definitely true. So just pulling this all together, what does this all mean, right? So one of the most known stereotypical features of Wisconsin English, bubbler, isn't actually even used by all Wisconsinites. It's used outside of Wisconsin as well, right? Tag questions, things like "ana" or "oh no," which is something that people are often aware of, are typical of Wisconsin, but they're changing in ways that we maybe didn't expect. And then finally, we're just beginning to understand these underlying changes in sounds that, including glottalization in Wisconsin English over time, and people are almost never aware of this. So that kind of complicates our picture. Things that we typically associate with Wisconsin English maybe are not as straightforward as we think. There might be features that we don't associate with Wisconsin English that actually are really robust features that you see in Wisconsin a lot. So Wisconsin English is a very complicated and ever-changing variety of English. So just to give a general conclusion, Wisconsin English is new. There's increasing awareness of it among listeners and in the community. And people generally have positive attitudes toward it, but what those attitudes mean is complicated. People believe it's friendly, but is it correct? Maybe, I don't know. The features we associate with Wisconsin English also are not necessarily used across Wisconsin, and they may also be used outside of Wisconsin. And then finally, Wisconsin English is changing rapidly, and so we're aware of how it's changing in some ways, but in other ways, there's still a lot more to explore. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
So do we have any more questions from the audience? Got one in the back?
I would ask either one of the speakers. When Glenda and I moved up here from Ohio, having lived in many other states and even countries, I have never heard until I got here people using the expression, me and him went fishing. These same people, some very educated, never say, me went fishing. But they will say, me and him went on a vacation or fishing. I never heard that before. Is that localized? Is that now national and I just didn't notice it? Is it upper Midwest? Objective and subjective are rearranged in this odd way, but what happened?
Can you repeat the question for those online?
Yeah, the question was a really good one, and it ties back into an earlier question of people from Ohio coming here and suddenly hearing me and him type sentences instead of he and I went fishing. I think it goes back to this earlier point about the way that English is changing with regard to those pronouns. Some of it is really just a change to the pronominal system, to the pronouns. So if you think about you, we don't have a nominative and a non-nominative form of you. You is the same form, whether it's the subject or a direct object or an indirect object. I gave you that. I saw you. You said that. It's always the same form. English used to, Old English was basically more complicated than German in terms of those inflections, those case inflections that it had. And over time, we've steadily lost all of that. This is the last little piece that we have floating around, basically, and it's going. It's going in different places at different rates, but it's definitely going. And it also interacts with the issue of correctness. Just like Lau and his double negatives, teachers can win some of those battles, but they can't win most of them most of the time. And the language is going to change. The stuff that teachers corrected me on are not the stuff that teachers corrected Sarah on. When I was growing up, it was what versus the wha versus wa, whether and whether was being corrected. That's just gone. Young people don't have that by and large here and in most other parts of the country. Some other changes are happening today that people are occasionally fighting but not really fighting. So young people are increasingly pronouncing words like don and dawn and cot and caught. So cot, the thing company sleeps on, and caught, the past tense of catch, the same. That's pervasive in the West now, in California and throughout the West. And it's made its way back into a whole bunch of the upper Midwest. It's widespread in the lower Midwest. People are not fighting that battle mostly. Some people do, but mostly they're not. And I and me and he and him, that fight is still ongoing. So people, you get sensitized to it in school, you're aware of it. If you actually listen to spontaneous speech, even really highly educated people, like you say, will do that. I mean, I do it constantly in speaking. I don't do it in writing. If I'm writing a scholarly manuscript, I don't do it. But I do it when I'm talking to my wife at home or talking to, you probably heard me do it today, Sarah, on the trip up here. So it's a change that's happening, and I don't know what it's going to ultimately end up looking like, but it's probably going to continue to evaporate. And it's evaporating in really specific ways. So in those situations like he and I, the second one is much more likely to be the non-subject pronoun. So you're much more likely to get him and me went to the store, and really not likely to get him and I went to the store. I'm sorry, that was kind of hard to say. So there are patterns there. Some of them are intuitively clear. Some of them you only see when you look at enough data. But it's breaking down very, very slowly. And I suspect this is one that the teachers are going to lose in the long run. So
I want to interrupt for a second and repeat the telephone number for those who are off-site that might want to submit a question. It's 715-942-9917. Okay.
I've heard people use a phrase, these ones. I found these ones. And that just seems so awkward. Where is this coming from?
I do not know the answer to that. So the question was these ones. I found these ones. And it sounds odd because the ones thing is sort of surprising, right?
Yes.
I can tell you that I've been this past week doing some work with actually Southern Illinois, looking at speakers from the 1960s, listening into, and that actually sounds like something that I would hear from a Southern Illinois speaker, where they, the speaker that I was listening to was doing a lot of like plurals where I would not put a plural, interesting things like, or singular where I would have a plural, and so that could be, I mean, that's something that I know is common, at least in Southern speech, and is something that may be more pervasive now across even upper Midwest. I don't know.
I think it's a really good example of how little we know about regional variation. I mean, the question about who has which Wisconsin features socially is a really important question, and we've got little bits and pieces of that, but we don't have the big picture. We know that some of the stuff is regional. I don't know that I say that one, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me so much to hear it. But definitely, I think Sarah's right. There may be some regional stuff going on there.
I've got an online question. Does it make a difference that originally the majority of the population in mid-Wisconsin came from Northern Europe and Scandinavian countries, and we have become much more homogenized in current years?
This is something that some students and I, or some students and me, I should say, I guess, some students and I are currently writing a paper about. When new dialects develop, like is happening here in Wisconsin, what happens is that people choose features that are out there they hear from other speakers, and they make them into regional features. So stuff like dim and dare and doze used to be because you had an immigrant background, you were from, or your family was from Poland or from Germany or something. And now it's much more associated in Wisconsin. We found this in our studies, much more associated with rural areas. So what's happening is it's being reallocated, we say. These features that used to mark immigrant background have become features of Wisconsin as a whole, or of some groups in Wisconsin, like rural versus urban. The really striking example of that, and it's very widely used in eastern Wisconsin, is once, like come here once. And we did those surveys, and people, mostly the Wisconsin features, people would say, oh no, that's not correct English. Oh, that's how old people talk. That's how rural people talk. With once, we did not get that reaction. That's clearly from German. There's a German word that means once that you use when you say a command, when you say an imperative, so it doesn't sound like a military order. If you speak another language, you know that you really tend to be very careful about being polite. You don't want to come across as rude in a language that you don't speak natively. And so the assumption is that the German speakers learning English and Dutch speakers learning English went out of their way to make sure they weren't sounding rude, and so they kept using that. That's out there. Young people use it in eastern Wisconsin, really widespread, and there's no negative association. It's not, this is how old people talk, this is how people in the country talk, this is bad English. People say, that's how we talk. So you're getting that kind of reallocation, that sort of change in the meaning of a feature in all sorts of interesting ways. Another one that we worked on a bunch is the pronunciation of what's a Z sound. We spell them as S's, but we say them as Z's. So things like his and hers and beers. People in eastern Wisconsin increasingly say his and hers and beers. And you can measure that the kind of way that Sarah was talking about doing measurements. And it's really clear it's not for most people stigmatized. It was stigmatized in the old Saturday Night Live skit about Da Bears. But most young people don't remember that or know that anymore. And in Wisconsin, it doesn't seem to be stigmatized. People hear it and say, yep, that's how we talk, that's fine. So there's a lot of that going on where those features that came from immigrant languages originally have made their way into our speech, but often sort of submerged. So we don't know, we don't make that association necessarily.
Go ahead, Mary.
So you talked about the T sound and the glottal change.
Yes.
Do you have research, or is anybody looking into why would you physically change where you put your tongue when you say a word? How does that happen?
So there's a lot of different reasons why that could be happening. One thing that's often used as an explanation is that we call it ease of articulation. It's just easier to say it, especially in faster speech, rather than actually moving your tongue. You're just making a change in your throat. That's just one way, one explanation that it could be. But there's other motive. Just it might be easier for the other person to hear, or there's train of thought here. But typically, one typical reason would just be that it's actually just easier for people to say, and also in faster speech. We did find that there was some correlation with the people who spoke faster tended to use the glottal forms more because it's just quicker for them to do that.
I've got a question online. Is there a Wisconsin pronunciation for either, neither, either, neither?
I've heard huge amounts of variation in that. I think most Wisconsinites I know say either and not either, and neither and not neither. Either speakers? Either speakers? Yeah, okay, well, this room, you are spot on about everything else I asked about, so I'm going to say, based on this sample, that it's either in Wisconsin.
Somebody wants you to say the word now. Again, it didn't sound like Wisconsin to me.
Me?
You.
Oh, that's beautiful. Now. And it does not sound Wisconsin. And it is so when we played those recordings and asked people to identify whether the speaker was from Wisconsin or not, we tried really hard to say, okay, here's a feature that would give away that the person's from Wisconsin. There weren't any features. There were a bunch of little things that kind of hinted, but one of the things that you get in Wisconsin is the pronouncement of the ow diphthong. And what typically happens is people tend to say it farther back in the mouth here, the first part, than I do. So I say now, and people here will tend to say now. I exaggerated that. I can't do it the way that you can do it. But that's definitely a difference, and that's definitely a dead giveaway.
I'm personally kind of surprised that Wisconsin English is becoming a thing and getting more distinct, because I would expect with more national media, television, podcasts, everything, that things would become more homogenized rather than more isolated.
It's
The more that you're online, for a long time, I watched a lot of British YouTubers and I started to pick up on the British accent. So I just suddenly start speaking in a British accent, I wouldn't even notice it. So, yeah.
That is something that I've heard a lot about, anecdotally, of people saying non-native English speakers even saying that they've picking up slang that they, and not even realizing that it's regional slang that they heard online. I know it's really common. But to answer your question about the homogenization, it's a really common belief that we are becoming more homogenized, that we're losing accents. I actually had this conversation with my own mom yesterday. But really, the media, in terms of television and things like that, have a lot less impact than we think on how people speak. It really has more to do with who you're actually interacting with on a daily basis, who might be influential. And there's a lot of, I believe, you can tell me that I'm wrong, there's a lot of research actually that there, in some regions, accents are actually moving farther away from each other. So especially as there are more divisions in terms of political and cultural divisions, rural versus urban speech moving farther apart from each other. So there actually is still a lot of, there are still a lot of accent changes that are occurring.
That's exactly right. I mean, some features are fading away, some features are giving ground, but new features are coming up. And I think that's part of what's so exciting about Sarah's work, is that sometimes these are features that we're not aware of at all, that it takes a long time to figure out, oh, that's actually happening. And these things will distinguish speech at this sort of low, almost subconscious level. But it's definitely moving apart. There's one really famous study showing the influence of media on speech, and it's in Glasgow, where there's a feature of London English, where they say F or V instead of TH sounds. So my throat hurts, that sounds smooth, and so forth. That's a really classic London working class feature. And Jane Stewart Smith showed in this, she just did these incredible studies where she showed that in Glasgow, which has a very different way of doing it, they say H instead of TH sound. So what you do with your brain is hink. I was hinking about that yesterday. So they don't have anything like that. She showed that people who followed a really famous TV show, EastEnders, where they do that all the time, people who were really devoted followers of that show would start picking up that feature. So what she doesn't know, and this is just because of how new the research is, what Jane doesn't know yet is in 10 years, when those young people are no longer following EastEnders or don't even remember EastEnders particularly, are they going to still be doing that? But it's really striking because it's rare to have a direct, really clear influence of media on somebody's pronunciation. You get lots of words and phrases and stuff, but you don't get many real pronunciations, sort of core pronunciations like that. So it's not impossible, but it's also not the most common pattern.
I'm interested in the speed of speech, that it's picked up and up and up. I taught for a while, and I was amazed at how my students talk faster, faster, faster. And I wonder, and even on TV, they're speaking faster and faster and faster. I wonder if just lifestyle and that speed of life isn't altering how we speak, how we say things, how we quickly or don't pronounce things.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, so her sense is that people are speaking faster and faster, and especially in teaching, watching young people, and they get faster and faster over time. That in the business is what we like to call a testable hypothesis. We can look at recordings from different eras of people of different ages and so forth and see if they've actually sped up. That's pretty doable. wouldn't be a bad paper, Sarah.
I spoke to a communication professor, and he was telling me that they are speeding up the sound on television. So what young people hear is a whole bunch of words and a whole bunch of slang, as quickly as possible, because they have to get it all in before the next ad is due.
Yeah, so the comment was that a communications professor says that on television they actually speed up the speech mechanically. That's doable, it's certainly possible, and that would be a potential correlate. We don't know very much about how fast people speak, remarkably. I did a study with a couple of colleagues at Ohio State where we tested the old stereotype that people in the upper Midwest talk faster than Southerners, and boy was it clear. Southerners talked way slower, Northerners talked way faster. And a bunch of people have done similar studies. There were a couple before us and a lot since. And the pattern is very clear. There's some regional differences. But we don't have any sense of change over time with that. We've got enough recordings that we could do it. And it's a pretty easy thing to measure. You just count syllables per second or something like that. But I don't know of anything about change. We did in our stuff with the glottalization when you were starting. You found some stuff.
Yeah, well, we didn't do any kind of real analysis of it, but I can tell you just the impression was that the speakers from the 1950s were speaking mostly slower than the ones from today. But it's hard to tell also because we're talking about different age groups. So the speakers from the 1950s tended to be older in their 50s and 60s versus the speakers that we were listening to from today were college students. And so there's also something there that maybe people are slowing down their speech as they age. So it would be interesting to get that middle generation of people who were born in the 1950s-ish and people, and to see whether or not there's any so people who are in their 60s, let's say today, versus 60s 50 years ago, and whether there's any kind of difference there in the speech, or in the speed of their speech.
Well, it would seem if you were going to speak faster and faster that you'd be less clear in your pronunciation.
Yes, and that is something that we found in the research was that the people who were speaking faster people who spoke faster tended to use the glottal forms more, and they tended to even just completely leave off the T at the end of words more often, and just so they were slurring it a little bit more.
So just a note about the speed and the glottalization. Sarah is right that we get these kinds of losses with correlating with speed. Those losses tend to be at the ends of words mostly. So it's natural that she's focusing on the ends of words here. That's where a lot of the action is. You don't get that the same way at the beginning of words. That's a really important part of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, because also even these changes that are taking place, maybe they're less clear or they're less what we would associate with more slurred speech, but speakers are unconsciously kind of balancing that so that they're still making sure that they're saying words that that the listener can understand. There's this balance between what's easier to say versus what's easier to understand. And so it's if you lose information at the end of a word, it's speakers or listeners tend to be able to still understand what you said if you've pronounced the beginning of the word more correctly, or not correctly, but so that's why you tend to lose these sounds at the ends of words versus you wouldn't lose a T from the beginning of a word because then that would be more confusing to the listener.
It kind of segues to something that I think I've noticed that people pronounce words ending in ing differently. Mm-hmm. Some people, almost hear the G pronounced, and others sort of drop it all off.
Yes, so ing versus in is very common. Actually, that's, so Joe mentioned a little bit that I'm going to be working on perception next and looking at how people's attitudes, how listeners feel towards speakers when they use certain versions of a word, certain pronunciations. There's a very famous study that was done that was looking at how people said ing words versus in versus ing and how that affected speakers' attitudes towards them. And it's, you get that variation really all across the country, I would say. It's something that's found here, but it's also found in the South. And For example, Southern speakers, if they use the in, parkin, workin, it actually doesn't affect people's perceptions of them because people already think of Southern speakers as being less educated and working class and less smart. So if they use the in version, parkin, there's nowhere for them to go down in people's opinions of them. Like, that sounds terrible, but that's just the attitude. Versus if you are from, let's say, Michigan, and you say workin', then if a speaker or if a listener hears somebody from Michigan say workin', then they say, oh, now this person is less educated. Versus if you're from the South and it doesn't matter what version you use, you're always going to be thought of as less educated. So that's kind of, it's interesting how people's perceptions work.
Are there any studies that look at, say, older people understanding younger people as they've changed their language, and how they, is there a distinct, I guess, perception that they can't understand the younger person speaking because they're changing the way they say it?
So it's typically not global understanding or lack of understanding. There's a whole lot of, I'm teaching a class on language change right now, and we're working on the section on meaning, changes in the meanings of words. And if you want to baffle old people, young people, just use a bunch of words that we don't understand. And the class is very conscious of that. They're very, they were having fun today, giving me words, saying, I bet you don't know this. And of course they were right. They could pull a bunch of those. The differences there's a lot of work on, like Sarah's talking about perception, and you take words out of context or manipulate them very slightly, and you do get increases of misunderstandings of that sort, but it's not that dramatic mostly.
Somebody online asked if you're familiar with the New York Times dialect quiz map,
Yes.
And do you consider it accurate?
It is as good as you can get in that kind of format. It worked horribly for me. It didn't work at all, but a lot of people think that it works. The problem is something that we tried to stress throughout the talk, right? That there's a huge amount of variation. And, just because somebody says one word one way doesn't tell you exactly where they're from. There's a ton of variation there. There, as well as you can crystallize the stuff, boil it down, they do a pretty good job of it. But there's a whole lot that you're just going to miss there. And one thing that we're finding, we've talked about this, Sarah and I have talked about this a fair bit. One thing that we're finding is if you look at earlier recordings of Wisconsin, there are all kinds of features that are found here, and sometimes today, that are just absolutely not associated with Wisconsin. So we think about wash for wash as a lower Midwest feature. You get that in parts of Ohio, you get that in Indiana, Illinois. You don't associate that, maybe Iowa, but you don't associate that with Wisconsin. Actually, historically, it's pretty well attested, and there are still students from Wisconsin coming to the UW-Madison who they won't say it in conversation, but if you talk about the feature, they'll come up after class and say, yeah, my aunt says that. So there's a huge amount of variation, and that makes it almost impossible to do that kind of distillation. But it's, as those things go, it's pretty good.
One thing I've used to notice when President Obama spoke was he would say "ta" instead of "to." We're going to go to Congress with this or something. Was that a Chicago thing, or is that a black dialect thing, or just his own thing?
Well, you can comment on Chicago.
I mean, it sounds normal to me, but I don't know if that's, I would definitely say that, but I don't know if that's specific to Chicago.
It's pretty widespread. I would say it too. I think what we've got is the question of he's extremely careful in how formal he is in what situation. Sorry, allergy season. He uses more casual pronunciations, or used casual pronunciations when I was listening to him on a regular basis, pretty strategically, and formal pronunciations when he needed to. So we all position ourselves, right? Like the way I speak in class is not the way I speak to my friends, and there are reasons for that. And flipping those around would be weird. Politicians are, I guess we're sitting in the council chambers. Politicians tend to be really aware of the effects of that stuff, and they will often really carefully gauge how formal and how informal they're being in a given situation. So Chicago aside, I suspect that that's a piece of the puzzle.
Here's another online question. Does your research ever find differences related to education level?
Yes. That tends to be actually how we measure class, which I think is always interesting because that's not always the case. But it is something that speakers with higher education level often just speak differently from speakers with lower education level.
Okay.
It's a big effect.
We had one comment and question from the telephone. The question and comment was that we're speaking more casually today, that we don't seem to take grammar as seriously, and across the board we're much more casual in our language usage. Do you see that as a trend? Do you see that as what's coming?
I do think that's probably true. I don't know. Yeah, casual in terms of, I think that there is a general better understanding, especially current generations, even in schools or other settings, of maybe different dialects or different, where there's less emphasis on teaching specific, correcting things that are, or teaching, like I said before, where we're not really teaching public speaking in the same sense, where you have like a different voice that you would use and different pronunciations that you would use for public speaking. We don't really make that distinction anymore. And there's also probably less distinction in terms of, even though we do make different changes, or we subconsciously change how we speak in a classroom setting versus in a friend setting, maybe not, I don't know if this is true, there may not be as much of a division as there was 100 years ago.
I think that's absolutely right. This is another area where we don't have really clear studies, but I think it's a pretty widespread sense among people who work on this that the range between formal and informal has gotten narrower, so that you have people, Obama's a good example. Obama has a really wide range of ways of speaking, and he adjusts according to his circumstances. I think that's become less and less common over time. People have a narrower range of ways of speaking in a lot of cases. And we don't have, that would be very hard to demonstrate in a rigorous way, but I think that's intuitively, I would be really shocked. I'm not a betting man, but I would bet you $20 that if there's a rigorous way to test that you would find that range has narrowed.
Here's another online question. I hear people say library and library. Is this regional or educational or some other form?
I don't think it is regional. I could be wrong about that, but I think that has to do with, well, library can also be, sometimes I've heard associated with African American English too, but it's also something that's library, that consonant cluster of like the B and the R, and then the is a little bit harder for people to say maybe, and so you end up deleting that R there just because it's an easier pronunciation. That's my impression.
Yeah, words like, how do you say the second month of the year?
February.
February.
It's I heard somebody, we were talking about accents yesterday, and a guy said, last week I heard somebody say February, which is almost impossible to do. Wherever you have two R's together, it's an issue, and R's are sort of slippery creatures in and of themselves. So yeah, there's a lot of variation.
Oh, here's another one. Jewelry or jewelry?
Part of what's happening here is so-called spelling pronunciations. People feel like they should pronounce things the way they're spelled. And at a talk like this a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, this topic came up, and I said, yeah, there's all sorts of weird things. Like the word O-F-T-E-N, it never had a T in it. It was just a spelling decision when they were regularizing English spelling that they put a T in it. And it's really weird. But there are millions and millions of people who say often. And the audience started laughing. And I said, what's so funny? And I had just, like in the answer to the previous question, I had said often, and apparently said the T really clear, so like everybody noticed it. And I had no idea I did that spelling pronunciation. It can't be how I grew up speaking. I had to have picked that up. So we do that, and again, this is sort of the thing of teachers and people who are interested in correcting grammar sort of choose their battles. That was, I'm sure that was something that teachers corrected me on, and I paid attention to it, unlike most things that teachers said when I was a little kid. And they win some of those, and they lose a whole lot of them. So you get spelling pronunciations, often just like the hypercorrection example before of between you and I, where you think, oh, I don't say I enough, I should put an I in there. And people will think, oh, I say library, but that doesn't sound right. I should say that other R. And so you get this sort of adjustment back, even though, as far as I can tell, in most communities, I think library is the at least in my experience is the normal way to say it.
Well, this has been fabulous. I don't hear any more questions. I don't see any more online. Oh, what's with that?
I have one more.
Oh, here we have one more. Okay.
You haven't talked very much about Wisconsin vowels. And I have a couple of them in mind. One of them is how you pronounce R-O-O-F and how you pronounce C-R-E-E-K, that I think are very Wisconsin. Because I have a roof on my house, because I lived in Canada for 26 years, and I lost a lot of my Wisconsin, and then in New Jersey before that. But and there are lots of little creeks in Wisconsin that everybody else calls cricks. But the vowel that I've heard really frequently tonight is the ah sound in Wisconsin, which Wisconsinites say Wisconsin, is that wide open ah that I associate that so strongly with Wisconsin pronunciation.
Yes, that is.
Yes.
Well, that's something that would, I think we said something about northern cities vowel shift maybe, and so that is something that's not just Wisconsin, but found in the Great Lakes region in general, which is that it's a chain. So what happens first is that the a vowel moves up in your mouth. You say it up, and so you say bad. Well, okay. If you're from Chicago, you say bad. If you're from Wisconsin, you shift your a vowel up and say bag. Is something that's I've heard is very common in Wisconsin. I don't say that, but bag or bag. And so you move that a vowel, and so then what ends up happening is that then your a vowel, which traditionally, like you said, is pronounced a little bit farther back, not as wide open, you then start saying it much more openly at the front of your mouth, with your tongue at the front of your mouth, and you say ah. And so that's just a typical of that upper Midwestern Great Lakes region speech. It's one very common feature.
Yeah. So you also gave the example of ROOF.
Oh, yeah. Roof.
How many people say roof? Most people. How many say roof? A tree has ROOT, roots.
Roots.
Roots? No roots? Couple of roots?
I don't know.
What about what you sweep with?
Broom.
My
What about
wife
what
says.
you ski behind. What about what you ski behind on the water?
Boat.
A boat? A boat.
Oh, nobody says but for that. That's got to be boat.
Boat. A boat.
So there are speakers in Wisconsin who say root and roof and room. You need to clean this room. And how do you clean the room? You do it with a broom. So it's after an R sound, and it's the oo sound, and it's especially before like an F or an M, so sounds that are made with the lips, but you get it with root as well. That's pretty variable, but it's widespread in the upper Midwest. Minnesotans have it, Wisconsinites have it. So was there another part to that? That was the two parts of that question, right?
Creek and crick.
Creek and crick.
Oh, that's a really weird one. In the South, so I grew up with a very heavy Southern accent and like really very, very non-standard English in lots and lots of ways. But everybody's got stuff that they think, oh, I would never say that. You just, no, that's not English anymore. That's too bad. That was how I thought about crick. There were people who said a crick instead of creek, and that just meant you were like, you really you barely spoke English if you said crick. I moved before I came to Wisconsin. I moved to Indiana, and I was stunned to find out that it's completely normal in northern Indiana at Purdue in Lafayette, West Lafayette. Completely normal for people to say, yeah, well, it's a little creek. We can cross it without getting our feet wet. And I couldn't believe it. And I thought, that's some weirdness of Indiana. And then I moved to Wisconsin, and sure enough, lots of people say crick up here. What's happened is that the variation is ancient. That variation's been around for a very long time between those two. But what's happened is it's settled out differently in the upper Midwest and in the South. In the South, it became a very stigmatized pronunciation, and it is not so stigmatized up here. And people are aware of it. I mean, if you talk to students about it, they'll say, oh, yeah, I've got cousins who say that. They know that it's different, and it's not particularly positively valued, but it's also not outrageous like it would be in some parts of the South, at least. Thank you. I knew there was a third part to the question.
So it seems like we're kind of talking about two different things here. There's pronunciation and diction, but then there's also word choices and how they get strung together. So in the academic and study world, what do you call these two distinct things?
So the pronunciation would be phonology and phonetics, and then the word choice would be syntax, or I guess semantics too. For words, and syntax is how we put the words together into sentences. Morphology is how we even put words together themselves. But all of this would be all put together under what you call language variation, sound change, things like that.
Okay, thanks.
We haven't even talked about word forms.
Oh yeah, I know. As I was
The past tense of to dive.
Oh,
Dove.
David.
Dived? Almost nobody. Dove? So you say dived?
Yeah, dive in.
Dive. He dived into the water.
So this was traditionally dived, and it has become dove, and dove has spread very rapidly. Past tense of to sneak?
Snuck.
Sneaked.
Really rich patterns of variation there. And a lot of people never think about this. And, well, snuck? Yeah, sure, that sounds fine. Wait, should I say sneaked? So there's a lot of change. Both of these variants have been around for verbs like this and a whole bunch more forever. And they're changing, but they're changing very slowly. So the pool of variation is sort of shifts a little this way or a little that way. But both of them are going to be around for a long time.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up. It's 8 o'clock.
Go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
No chairs to put away.
No chairs to put away.
That's a good thing.